Well, hello, America. This is Commander Alan Palmer, your host for Stars and Stripes. And we're here with you again for another memorable moment of looking into what's happening in today's military and some current events that we'll talk about which affect the performance of our folks in uniform and how they're conducting a war today. As some of you may know, I'm one of the old timers here at STARRS, and I was back in Vietnam 55 years ago doing my first tour in Thailand, flying over North Vietnam every day. That was kind of a tough time for us because then we were fighting a war that was of necessity, but somewhat the same as today, provoked by a foreign aggression and leading us into doing some slow burn and getting people into a country as advisors and then getting further into it with a full-on war. And what we had to fight with at the time was a lot of it left over from World War II and some newer versions of both aircrafts and armored vehicles and weapons, which really kind of went back to World War II or Korea. And so we had to fight as best we could then, and we depended a great deal on the professionalism and the ability of our warriors to fight and win. And that was really the war of very kinetic warfare, where the warrior was the one doing the job. Folks back in desks or support were helping that, but we depended entirely on the ability of the warrior to carry on the missions that had to be done. That changed a little bit in subsequent battles with the Middle East. Things didn't always go so well. We had better equipment and a lot of other things, but some of the leadership was different. And some of the support we've got from back home wavered at times as well. And nothing was worse than the Afghanistan withdrawal that would demonstrate that. And we had a long ways to fall. We've recovered now, and our forces are back up pretty much where they should be, in my estimation. The young folks out there fighting today are doing things that we did 50 years ago and better. Their accuracy, their effectiveness, their professionalism, and their ability to take care of themselves is nothing like I've seen before. And I just wanted to make that comment to those of you who have been in the military or with the military, or like I have and my guest today have grown up in the military. It's a very special and very noble program that we use to make sure our nation stays free. And with that thought, that leads me to our guest today. I've got a very special guest. He's now the head of our advisory board for STARRS. And then that makes standing together against radicalism and racism even more effective because we have a broader reach with people who have been, like you're talking about today with me, involved in the military. And that's what my guest, Colonel Bill Connors, has done his life. And Bill has served in the Army as a colonel in Afghanistan. He's received a Bronze Star for his work there. He's also, when he retired, started his own great law firm in South Carolina, which we'll talk about a bit. And he's received numerous awards for that too. So Bill is carrying on the same role that the rest of us have, having the torch passed to us over time to take care of the country and do things for people that make a difference. And so, Bill Connors, it's great, sir, having you with us today. Thanks for taking your time to talk about our military, about our country, and what makes us great.
Thanks so much, Alan. I want to mention that my son is now the fifth generation he's serving right now. So that I think, as you and I both know, this really is a family business, and so I'm glad you
It
brought
is.
brought that up. I'm retired now, but he's still carrying on the family business.
And which service is he in?
Army, yeah, we've been
Okay.
it's all been five generations of Army for us, um, but it's really been a great life as part of it.
Yeah, and that is the source of much of our recruiting that really stays very stable. You know, people who have grown up in the military, like we have as military brats, as we used to like to call ourselves. You know, we've lived it. We know what it is, and it's no surprise to us when we get into the service on active duty that we know what we need to do, and it's a pretty good source. So thanks for sharing him with us. In my case, though, I'd have to say that in my case, I'd have to say that there's a little bit of a family issue there, because my father and grandfather were both Army Air Corps and then Air Force when they changed into the Air Force. So I joined the Air Force and fought in Vietnam that way. But then after the war, I ended up getting a direct inter-service transfer to the Navy. And that kind of went over not real happily with some of my family members. But they got used to it after a while. But my point is, it's all the same. You know, we're all doing the same kind of work. One service versus another doesn't make that much difference.
Well, Al, if I can mention something with that, because it ties into, I think we're going to talk about, is how important I think it is to be cognizant of military families when it comes to recruiting retention. Because
Yes.
what I saw, particularly during the last administration, was they I saw efforts really to push away from that, to almost sideline where we receive most of our recruits, which is those that come from military families. You know, there's a some philosophy that that's not healthy, that the military caste argument, but I haven't found it. I don't think you found it. We've never been in danger of a coup, and quite frankly, in the all volunteer force, it's one that we see in different professions. Whether you're practicing law, medicine, there is a tendency of children that grow up seeing that, experiencing that. There may be a hereditary component to it as well that then go into it, and we need to continue to foster that. And it's something I've seen with President Trump is he will call out descendants of some of our notable forebears and the fact that their descendants are still serving. And when I came through, again, a fifth generation, in my case, fourth generation. Well, let me put it this way. If you take my great great grandfather, he fought in gray, but ever since then, it's been in blue. Four generations of U.S. Army, and now my son. And that tradition is one that, that I see continuing on. And I see it with friends. I know those I grew up with. Not all of them, but a very high number went in the military, and they're happy. And they provide something. And so it doesn't mean we still recruit elsewhere. But I noticed during the Biden years that recruiting was in the toilet. There's no other way to put it. And they were looking
Yeah.
for places like the two mommy commercial out in liberal areas in California where where's the bang for our buck in recruiting versus going to areas that we know and families we know that can provide those things. Additionally, that the families all talk. And so I know during that time frame, because of all the stuff that we fought against, the cultural Marxism in the military, families were telling their young not to go in. In my son's case, he got his ROTC scholarship at the Citadel during the Trump timeframe. If that had been during the top Biden years, I'm not sure what I would have told him about going in. But thankfully, he's in now. He's serving under Trump, again. But those are things I think that are very important.
Well, that was lasting up until just recently. I remember about a year ago, I was giving a speech up in Minnesota, and to a joint military function. And this lieutenant colonel came up to me. He says, "My son's in the Air Force Academy, but sir, he doesn't really think he wants to stay." And I said, "Why would he say that? He's in one of the best places in the world to get an education and also to serve his country. Why would he change his mind?" He said, "Well, because they weren't respecting it, and people were getting out, and people were grumbling, and nobody was supporting them, including some of the faculty at the academy." And I said, "Look, just hang tight, let him stay. It'll be okay, I'm sure." And he wrote me back just a few days ago and said, "Thanks for that." He said he is graduating, and he'll stay. But that is, you're right, the climate that has existed. I think there's also been a public perception, and tell me what you think about this, but there have been people who have said, those folks in the military, they're all a bunch of assassins anyway. They train them to kill people, and they're the ones that are out there doing all these shootings and the bars and everything else, and you can't trust them. And geez, why do we have to put up with them? They just don't understand the difference in the cultures.
No, you're exactly right. The other thing is that it's like this recent shooter who spent a few years in the National Guard. I don't think there's any other profession that gets stigmatized for one member. For example, someone drives a truck for a couple of years, later on, becomes a bank robber, does whatever. The first identification is not that at some point he served as a truck driver, but in the military, if someone has any service at all, and what you really find in many cases these are not folks that are necessarily going off to combat. Not every case anyway. They do serve for a bit. A lot of times they have disciplinary problems. They are let go from different angles. And again, this guy apparently did have problems. He served a few years in the National Guard. He was, he was let out. There's other examples like I use as well, but you rarely see, folks that have really done long-term service that come from military families that are involved in this kind of thing. But again, the unfortunate part is that someone has any service at all, they're now a veteran, and that's the first thing the media loves to throw up there, and make it appear as though we're a danger when we're really not.
Well, is there not a kind of a parallel there with the society? Increasingly people are being less responsive to their behavior, and they're always looking for outs somehow. There are very few penalties for what they do. That's very different than in the military, is it not?
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a disciplined environment, and that's again why many times these folks that we see, like McVeigh, for example, way back 30 years ago, he had serious problems. Left out after a very short period of time, and of course, obviously did what he did. But those that stay in generally get a lot of discipline, learn a lot about hard work, and generally do a great job in the civilian community once they finally, whether they retire, do honorable service. And people recognize that. I know in our state, South Carolina, for example, very pro-veteran because Southern men in particular predominate toward the military. It's just a fact. And it's also something our recruiting needs to understand as well, is there are certain areas, particularly, the Southern culture, conservatism. The polls are clear on that if you're looking for recruits, it's military families, but in general, there's plenty of exceptions. They are from more conservative, traditional, Bible Belt type places. And that's where you find your mainstay. And I think, again, I want to get to the problem I saw was the recruiting under Biden was purposely marginalizing that fact and even marginalizing military families. And I do see Trump taking the opposite direction, and we're seeing the explosion, the great, recruiting numbers, despite issues I think we're going to talk about with overall society and those that are able to serve. The current administration has just done an incredible job with recruiting compared to the Biden years.
Oh, yes. We've had several of these podcasts that covered that, and we were sitting there, kind of going, how low is this going to go? How bad does the problem get? And it was awful. I mean, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy were not meeting their standards or their goals for recruiting every year. Only ones that were the Marines. And then people started saying, so wonder why it's the Marines? What's going on there? Well, it's because the Marines weren't putting up with us, and they were not swallowing the Kool-Aid.
Well, they're also much smaller, so that does make a difference as well.
And very focused.
They marketed themselves, they branded themselves as being something tough to get into, and that drives in the kind of person that's going to be that way in that culture. If you try to sell it the wrong way, you can bring in some of the wrong people. But I think back to just right after Biden came in office, that extremist stand down. One of the first acts he did, trying to tie things into January 6th, because there were veterans over there. That was extremely harmful to morale, recruiting, retention, because it really made the whole military feel like, we were a danger to society and that we were full of extremists. And from my end, considering I was commissioned in 1990 as a new second lieutenant, and I think about that period, And it couldn't have been more sort of meritocratic and racially integrated. So the highest ranking officer at that time was who? Colin Powell. That's
Yeah.
1990, so 36 years ago. So when they came to the extremist stand down, and I think of like where the military went coming through, integration all the way through the 70s, 80s, up to the 90s, where the senior ranking guy was a great black officer, and no one really questioned how he got there. It was a meritocratic environment, so there wasn't that question. But the divisions that were caused by the left and by bringing in the cultural Marxism and all those things that divided us, that's the issue. And it started again with the extremist stand down, but then also continuing on with things like the sort of drag queens on base and all the radicalism
Yep.
they pushed. And the unique thing about our environment is that you got no privacy, and that's something that we had understood before. And it's one of the reasons why we did have initially the ban on homosexuality, and they went to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Was a reason for it was the lack of privacy, and what that does in those situations where you're living on a tank with somebody, that has got to be recognized as different than being in an office environment like I am now, where you can get away from people and you only work with them, but you're not showering with them, you're not living with them. These are just sort of things that we knew, that again would affect morale. And yet during the Biden years, the Obama years, they dropped the ban on transsexual service and things that really were just detrimental to morale, discipline, and Trump
Well,
is really trying to bring it back.
well, I remember that when they did the stand down because they're looking for white supremacists, and
Right.
they shut everything down for well, it was about a week as I recall.
No, it
But
was
anyway,
longer.
what
Sure.
longer than that? Well, okay. But the whole idea there is they went looking for the boogeyman. They didn't really find him, did they? As I
No,
recall, there were about 100 troops that they found that had some radical association somewhere out of a couple of 3 million, and
well,
that the numbers just speak for themselves there.
sure. And our current Secretary of War, excuse me, Pete Hegseth, remember he was supposed to go with his National Guard unit to be there when they really made a show of 30,000 National Guard to protect
Yes.
Congress after January 6th.
Yep.
Just incredible. In fact, I really thought about that compared to calling up hundreds of National Guard, during the when they were having to help ICE out. That they're bringing up troops. Well, in D.C. we had 30,000 National Guard, and Pete Hegseth couldn't go because he had a Jerusalem cross tattoo on his chest, and therefore he was tagged as being in the extremist area, and just shows you how low we went during that time period. And so,
And so those factors, though, as we discussed earlier, with military families and people who know the military, are very important to recruiting. But there's another aspect to that too, and that is the confidence and the faith in the enlisted ranks of those who are leading them, and particularly the young officers who are new out of the academies, but also the senior, flag officers who are making decisions for everybody. When those decisions prove not to be right, instead of looking the other way, those need to be acknowledged. There needs to be some accounting for that. And when it doesn't happen, even the senior folks say, "That's it, I've had it, I'm leaving."
no, you're exactly right. And watching things at my level, retired as a colonel, so my contemporaries becoming general officers, anyone there could see the push to sort of force again move away from the meritocracy we've been into numbers. And you remember the chief of staff of the Air Force, who the Secretary of War let go, had written a paper about driving down the number of white pilots. Why would you ever put that? That is so far beyond what I grew up with in the military. Of course, we believed in equal opportunity and being fair, but never that our goal needs to be a reduction in a certain race to pump up other races or sexes. And it just really, it's one that when it comes to the defense of the nation, you've got to have the absolute best people. When it comes to flying planes, we all talk about this, but if you get onto a plane, you want the absolute best pilot. If you're going to open heart surgery, you want the best surgeon. And that's where some of the ideologues within the cultural Marxism really don't get the effects they have on everybody, because then it just breaks down trust. And we all see it. And so I'm glad to see, again, the administration tackling this very heavy.
Well, they did that kind of where I live here in Central Texas at Randolph Air Force Base. They decided they were going to have a pilot training class that was all either black or female or some other construct that they wanted to show was responsive to DEI. And when they did it, it just totally failed. I mean, they had a
Right.
washout rate that was almost 100% of that cadre of people they wanted to put in. Had nothing to do with their individual talents, but it just showed that that meritocracy will trump everything.
Well, I tell you, I was an infantry officer. I served in light infantry, ranger training units, various different types of infantry. And here's the bottom line: is as you get closer to the point of the spear in the Army and the Marine Corps, particularly the infantry, um, your physical state matters. Physical attributes matter more than almost anything, because you could go hand to hand, you could go bayonets. I mean, the possibility is there. It's a possibility of carrying a 250-pound person with all their gear is very, very, the chance is very high of that happening. And let's face it, men have 50% more upper body strength than women on average. So there are physical differences, bone structures, and all that are just realities. They are physical realities that, when you look at numbers, you don't want to push the numbers. You want merit to let things go where they are. And during the last administration in particular, it was one where, I just don't care. My brain says that, for example, men and women are exactly the same, and in every way, shape, and form. And I don't care what reality is. We're gonna push that square peg into a round hole, and we see what happens with it. And we see it on the ground too. And of course, the troops seeing it know that they just let it go to the best person. That's the bottom line. And also the reality that, for example, again, I was openly opposed to gender integration within the combat arms, particularly the infantry and special operations, because I don't think that making the changes that had to be made for the very anecdotal individuals that might be able to make it was worth it in terms of national defense. There are a ton of things, as you know, that disqualify men from serving in combat arms type units. It's not their fault;
Yeah.
they're born that way, but
Yeah.
they've got to have. And I just, that's again the ideology that was pushed before.
Well, again, if you overlay that with the promotion system within the military, if you don't get the job, you don't get promoted. And that goes back down to that issue of meritocracy again. If you subvert the professionalism and the meritocracy just to promote somebody so that you can occupy a space that says, hey, we're here, everybody can do this. No, everybody can't do it, as you
Right.
described. And so now you've got your own internal problem developing underneath that, which only adds to the retention problems and then also affects recruiting. Because how can you
Right.
recruit
Exactly.
somebody that says, come join us, but everybody else is going out the back door? Well, why are they doing that?
Right. Well, exactly. And again, setting the environment. People that go in the military want to be focused on war fighting. And let's face it, war fighting is killing people, being prepared to kill people and break things, to be
Yep.
very blunt about it. And being prepared to do that, we bring peace. Because the tougher we are, the sort of scarier we are, the more kinetic we are, the less we'll have to use it. But if you're not like that, then you'll have to go into combat and you won't be as ready for it. And particularly if you're not in a meritocracy where you're getting the absolute best people into the right jobs that they need to be. And so, everyone sees that. And so as they make a decision, do I go in the military? They're going to go into it if it sticks to what it's been, which is we are the military. Our job is to fight for the nation.
Yeah. And I think you can see that almost year to year as those forces within the military change as you described, where you go from one level to another, you see those same levels of participation and retention going on too. You know,
Oh yeah,
and people vote with their feet. I mean, it's an all
sure.
volunteer force.
Oh, sure. And the other piece, and we've talked about this in STARRS, is the pipeline of those who are coming up to be able to be recruited. So the eligibles, the 18 to 24-year-olds that we need, particularly in the enlisted ranks, if we had to fight a major theater war against a peer competitor or near peer competitor. And we know now that has become a big issue because we can't rely solely on the military families and the those that are the numbers that are currently joining the all volunteer force. The other problem is when you look historically at what's happened in major combat or major wars, World War One and World War Two, is when we went into it. There's not as much. Most people don't realize this history, but in both those wars, there were millions who were rejected for physical reasons that couldn't join. And particularly when we talk about World War II, there was millions after Pearl Harbor that were 4F that could not come in for various different physical reasons. And remember, in 1944-45 in Europe, we were running out of troops. And we were actually in one of the better situations compared to, say, the Soviets at the time or some other nations where we had a huge population, but we had a huge population that really wasn't eligible. We lowered the bar some, but there were a lot that wanted to serve that just could not. And we're seeing that now because after those times, World War I and World War II, we realized this is not just a military problem, this is societal. And in schools, they've got to have things like PE, physical education. And that used to encompass, by the way, a lot more than just exercise. It was one where they realized like dental care and all kinds of things that would lead toward people being, if it wasn't handled properly, 4Fs, not able to serve. And so those things became important within high schools in particular. And so after, for example, World War II, you came to near universal PE requirements where you either did a sport or PE, but everyone needed to stay in shape because we needed the manpower in case it ever came where we had to call up the numbers we needed during a major war. In the 2000s, well, 1990s, but then 2000s, for a bunch of reasons, the importance of computers and you name it, those requirements drifted away to where now it's a distinct minority of schools that require some kind of PE beyond people to do sports. And so, to give you an example of the way the numbers have gone, at the start of COVID, the number of eligible for service, 18 to 24-year-olds, was around 27% of Americans. So 20%, 7% of those, that's pretty low. But at the end of COVID, and now it's down to 22%, and it's going down. Those are eligibles, not those who necessarily want to serve, but those who aren't obese, those without psychiatric type issues, those without criminal record, all the various things that knock people out, and that's disturbing. And the way to, because again, we can handle it right now, but if we did have to fight China or fight possibly Russia or something else where we needed the numbers that we saw during World War II, we'd be in a very, very tough situation with what we got. And it's something that we need to focus on. I know STARRS does, but even things like junior ROTC and the Civil Air Patrol, there are those programs that for example, Alan West was in junior ROTC, and Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, that's his background, where his father had served in World War II, but that really gave him a start in the military. And so that's something else that we can really focus on as we look at eligible numbers that can serve when the time comes.
But there is kind of an enemy within when it comes to the qualifications that people have to pass and live up to. The service has reduced those in the last couple of years just because recruiting was so bad and retention wasn't doing anything either. So they're bringing people in that had, as you described, some mental issues, some drug use issues, and then there were, transgender surgery folks and all that who came in. The problem was some of them, though, when it came time for their unit, if they finished training, got into it, and they were getting ready to deploy, those people were now non-deployable because they're on
Right.
medications that they had to continue, or they had dental work that had to be done, or worse, they had some sort of a psychiatric condition that was still bothering them, they were not going to go with everybody. And so you
Right.
now have them, but you don't have them, right? And it comes back to their ability to do the job and perform well, especially under pressure. But in the old days, back in World War II, kids weren't on drugs so much, certainly. They might have been smoking and doing some other things that were a problem, but they were normally a much healthier bunch, probably, than what we're looking at today.
Well, that's also why Trump's agenda with MAHA, Robert Kennedy, and trying to make
Yep.
people healthier. I mean, the diet, the exercise, trying to push down. I remember they used to the presidential fitness qualification when I was a kid back in the early '80s under President Reagan. You earn a little badge by going out and doing certain physical things and being the best at that. Those
Yep.
are things he's trying to bring back to get our youth, because obesity is a major part of this. I mean, there are other things too, but that the number of obese young people went up substantially, even leading up to COVID, particularly since COVID. And you're seeing that in the military too. The numbers that are overweight. They've made some changes. So, for example, if you score a high enough PT score, then you don't have to necessarily meet the tape standards within weigh-in, and that may be a good thing, quite frankly. In that, I remember I used to score 300 top score, but you had to be taped out. So they're kind of taking that and moving that away. But that whole issue right now of how do we get down to the young people and make sure they are ready, and also the interest in serving, because that's another part that we've got to keep up there. There's been a lot of black eyes that the left has given us with the military, the perceptions that they give, which are just
Yep.
false. One falsehood thing right away is that when you look at the enlisted, which would be the sort of generally within, say, a corporation, the working class, the blue collar side of things, is they're generally at a higher level socioeconomic than their counterparts out in the civilian world. So generally, those that can come through the pipeline to get in are a higher caliber person all the way around, whether enlisted or officer. Just something keep in mind as we're looking at recruits. Now, one thing you mentioned, by the way, that is important to understand about the recruiting numbers is they started a program under when recruitment really went down in the Biden administration, and that was the sort of pre-basic training that they put people through, and that's helping because it takes someone who couldn't get in basic training right away. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
losing weight, but a lot of times it's the ASVAB scores they make, the mental, the test scores, and they're boning them up for it to pass what they need to get in, and that's good. But the only problem I've heard about though is that kind of can still lower the bar of the average person, and so they don't retain them after 2 years. The numbers they're getting out of 2 years are much higher than they were before. Additionally, you mentioned like standards were lowered. One standard, which I have mixed feelings on, is they now allow recruitment in the Army all the way up to 42. It used to be, I believe, 32, as I recall correctly. And part of the reason for that was because if you bring someone in, if they're going to do a 20-year career, if they come in at 32, they're 52 by the time they hit 20 years, where they would be hitting senior NCO positions. If you come in at 42, obviously you're talking now at ages where they just can't continue on with the
Yeah.
military. And so that helps with the numbers, but for the long term retainability, that doesn't help.
Well, and that's kind of what we want people to do is find ways to serve as long as they can. But you're right, they've got to be fit. They got to, and standards are important. I mean, people's lives depend on their ability to perform well. And if they can't, yeah, someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to die.
Right.
So
And that's
there's another aspect of this too I wanted to talk to you about a little bit, as we mentioned earlier, that we know, and that is the families of those that are in the military. When people do join, we've got to find, I think, some better ways to take care of the families. And we saw that in Vietnam when someone was lost or severely injured, and first thing they do is pack the family up, move them out. Well, wait a minute. What does everybody else do? the rest of the unit, has to put up with that, and that's kind of a negative in retention and morale as well. So there are some things there that still probably need to be changed a little bit.
Well, no,
And a
you're
lot of
right.
times, wives don't always feel like they're recognized or they're understood in many cases because the spouse is gone, TDY someplace, and maybe for extended periods of time under really arduous conditions. And even though today we have email and some better ways to stay communicating, that used to be a real problem and still is in many places, I think, because when the husband is gone or the spouse is gone, then the one that's left behind with the kids and the bills and everything else, they still have to put up with life.
No, you're exactly right. And we all have our stories in military families of, like my grandfather went off to World War II, and of course they stayed until the war, till Hitler shot himself, to the war that Germany surrendered.
Yeah,
They were away from their loved one. Now changed obviously, sort of Korea leading to Vietnam with the 1 year tours. And my last thing I was away 15 months. That was a long time with Afghanistan. And you're right. The spouses in that case, I had three young children and a wife who was working. And I will tell you this bit too is that something that is different is most of the wives do work now. So that has to be understood, and that's something that states can help out on. By the way, transferability of, for example, licensing. Real estate
yeah,
license, the other types of license is recognizing, that from other states, particularly among or specifically among those that are military spouses, so they don't have the same kind of problems because, again, when I grew up, most of the wives really didn't work. They watched the families and that sort of thing. And there's still some that do that, but a higher percentage now do have jobs. And so when it comes to service members moving around, that is a very important thing to be cognizant of, which I think at times we're not, and some I think that we could do better at. But you're right too. Things like notification systems, but also traditions. That we bring families into,
yeah.
that they get together, they understand the traditions they're coming from, family days, and getting the sons out there in jeeps like I did when I was a kid growing up, and the soldiers taking them out. So our Boy Scouts out camping and things of that nature that really helped lead me toward a military career, which I loved. So there is a lot more to be done there.
The other things that I've noticed, we used to have a pretty robust system of officer clubs in the military, and also as
Yeah.
well as NCO clubs, chiefs messes, and things which recognize their seniority and their participation where they were. Today, it seems like everybody's off on their own and going to town and celebrate with somebody, but we're not doing it so much together.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, again, coming in commission 1990, one of the greatest things I remember about the early 90s was the aftermath of tailhook.
Yeah.
And of course, you being Navy are very well aware of that time
Yeah,
period. I think it was
I got blamed for most of that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm just, you recall, I'm sure you recall, because the whole military, it
Oh yeah,
was one that was, the classes, and one of the things that came from it was the deglamorization of alcohol and, the
yeah,
things that, there's some good in that, but there was also afterward kind of one of, what I noticed being, again, watching things as a kid in the 70s and 80s, becoming a cadet. And my first few years in, you're right, there was clubs and where lieutenants could put their hair down, well, what hair they had as in the infantry, but let their hair down and have a few drinks and build a camaraderie. And then in particular after tailhook, it was just one of sort of everyone's walking on pins and needles and eggshells and everything else, from what at least was publicized about the whole thing. And of course, there's a lot of accounts that, again, sort of willing participants, whatever else, but the way it was portrayed was something that went into much more. And again, it filtered out. And I suppose there's obviously some good if you watch. We don't want to see DUIs. We don't want to see that sort of thing. But I noticed that was, to me, sort of the beginning of the end of the club system. and some of those traditions that we had, all because of one event.
Well, and I can tell you that in Vietnam days, and I'm sure it was that way in World War II as well. That's how you kind of recovered from the trauma of what you were doing every day. You know, you come home after being shot at and wondering whether you're going to make it to the next day. Sometimes that was your lifeline, was just to hang out with the buds in the bar and have a couple of drinks, go home and sleep it off, and then go back out the next day and do it again. Today,
Yeah,
everybody seems to have PTSD that they can't explain. Uh, and I can tell you that all the people I flew with and knew in Vietnam, there wasn't a single one that had PTSD.
yeah, it's interesting you say that because people have asked me, and again, being in the infantry, I just shoot to kill. I saw folks get killed, but it's the same thing that's happened throughout history within, warfare and everything else. And I don't want to belittle. There's sometimes, in fact, actually, in some cases, those in the medical side of things saw more because we got, when someone was wounded or killed or whatever, we kept going on. They were taken care
Yeah.
of, sent to the rear. So that actually, in some cases, could have caused a bit more of a PTSD issue. But you're exactly right. I personally found that those who were disciplined, that did their job, that and really there wasn't this constant like harping on, do you have PTSD and all that. I mean, I know when I went in for, I finished 30 years, folks saying, look, after what you've done, you should put in for PTSD. And I mean, I don't, I'm sorry, but I don't. And I really, at this point, you can harp on things so much that they can become a self-fulfilling prophecy in some cases. And I'm not trying to take away from those that do have serious problems, but I agree with you that, going out to combat, and I will say this bit too. I do remember, we got done with firefights where folks had to kill the enemy, that they would talk about it around like campfire type things. And yeah, I
Exactly.
shot that guy here. It's soldier talk, which civilians wouldn't understand because they'd think it was kind of gruesome, and all that. But it was psychologically so critical that they did talk it through. That what they did was not wrong. They were shooting at us. We shot at them. We saw things when they got shot, but we were doing our job, and it was okay. And I'm Christian. I follow, but it's the command is thou shalt not murder. And you're not murdering in combat. And so people understanding that, I think, is extremely important. But that also comes down to the camaraderie thing that we do have, particularly guys getting together, talking these things out, like you just mentioned, because we did the same type things. Unfortunately, we had a General Order One in places like the Persian Gulf or Afghanistan where you couldn't drink at all. So we may have had our near beers, I guess. But we talked about you being in Thailand was a little bit different, where you did have the access to go do that, sort of like the bomber pilots in the UK during World War II, who came back in and would have really lost their
Yeah.
buddies in the bombings and a chance to do that. But I do think it's important to head the camaraderie. But that's also where I go back to again, where the all male, particularly infantry, was one that there was something there that was just different. And I think Pete Higgs has talked about that. I know he's got a bunch of pushback, and it's not about the one or two people who could do something. It's about the whole environment and morale and again recognizing physical differences between men and women.
But isn't leadership a huge part of that? When you've got the right people there that can monitor what's happening, they can cut off things that works out to be borderline bad behavior. And a good leader will see that thing.
It's interesting you say that. I thought back to my own career and at the troop level, being with troops, again, infantry, all my experience was all male until I went on a mission to the Sinai. That's peacekeeping between Egypt and Israel. And we
Uh,
had some elements attached to our infantry battalion in the logistics and the MPs, about 10 females with a infantry task force of about 700 guys. And so it was the first time I kind of saw things. And it was interesting because the sexual issues that came up what I saw were not with the disciplined infantry units. They were actually with some of the other attached units that were, perhaps were not as disciplined, that's where we saw, some of the shenanigans and things that caused issues. So you're exactly right that the matter, discipline is so critically important in all this. And the infantry guys generally just wanted to stay away from all that, focus on their mission, and and keep that kind of line. They were not the ones, at least in that case, that were involved in some of the issues we had, sort of intersex type issues that come up.
Yeah, and God bless them for being sturdy enough to do that. But it is still one of those realities of life, and Navy discovered that when we started integrating the sexes on ships. Very close living conditions, and that can be a problem, not just for the sailors, troops on board, but also for families back home.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's definitely one as far as the Navy goes. I was thinking about one other issue you mentioned about the communications, and I think from the Navy that if Jody got his wife when he's deployed, he's probably not going to find out until, I guess, some port of call months down the road. Whereas, one thing with communications, and that's one example, but the fact that they can communicate virtually daily. I went out on a Navy ship actually for a few weeks when I was in the
Yeah,
Army, and I just talking to the Navy guys. That was one of the things that it was 2004, so they were kind of moving into the ability to communicate on a
yeah,
much bigger, greater level than instead of once every few months, it was virtually every day. And so if Jody got their girl back home, they're on the ship, they know about it. So there was challenges that came in that were just not the same, or things that happened on the ship, whether injuries, death. I know when in Afghanistan, it was really when someone was killed. Really big thing about cutting off communications to make sure we notify people correctly, because that's a huge challenge for those that are deployed.
and that's a lot of responsibility, particularly if you're talking about a young second lieutenant or a young sergeant in charge of something. They're not quite as experienced with length of service. It may be more challenging for them to deal with. But what I found was they grow into that pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing. I talked to my son too. Just a reminder that I was 23 in charge of millions and millions of dollars of equipment with my four Bradleys and 35, you know, men who almost all of them were older, or many of them were older,
Yeah,
excuse me, especially my sergeants and my platoon sergeant. You grow up
yeah.
pretty quick. I mean, in my late 20s, a company commander in charge of 150 people. And again, a lot of them older. My first sergeant, definitely older. And knowing you're responsible for their lives and a lot of things that a business manager would never have to do. And so that's one of the things that the military gives you, that I think, civilian world, I think, does get it, that nothing I've done since the military kind of reaches that level. I mean, I'm doing important things, but not, as far as the responsibility, the life and death, I don't really deal with that now.
Well, and that's probably the natural flow of most things anyway. The other thing that sometimes is missed is the training that we do to get people ready for those things, particularly in the academies. We spend a lot of money and time with education that's focused on their role in the future, mostly technically. But we spend a little less time teaching warrior ethos and how to use the knife that you're actually having built for you. How do you do that? That's the real mystery, I think, in training somebody, particularly in the academies. You want them to come out as people who have an ability to develop their own thinking about how to lead, how things work. But you can't do that without a little bit of risk, can you?
No, you're exactly right. Just like in training, you want to make training as close to realism as possible, which means there can be casualties unless you're not going to train realistically. And there's a lot more casualties in war. And so I've actually lost more people, I think about it, through my 30 years in training accidents than I can think about really around me in combat. Not that we didn't lose people in combat, but I went to an NTC rotation where sort of a best friend, lieutenant, his platoon sergeant, they both died just from accidents, that occur. And I can think about other examples too of that happens. But it is one where, you've got to train for this stuff. And so I use the realistic training, but also in the academies or, Citadel's senior military college. So same mindset type of thing is that being reminded this is about life and death, and that you are going to
Yeah.
be asked to shoot to kill people, and that it is important that you get that. That's something that really bothered me when the Democratic congressman got up and told military members you don't have to follow orders that are illegal, so on. So well, we're not supposed to follow orders that are illegal, but it gets you questioning orders. And the reason I think back to when I was in Afghanistan, about to go into a firefight. Well, actually, we were moving into a firefight, and I had a young, I think he was a specialist private, but he was on the machine gun, and we were getting fired at by machine gun. And when you first start firing back at the enemy, it's a bit surreal. I had to kind of order him. It's okay, shoot to kill him, and he did fire back and got the guy. But the point being that like you can't have that hesitation, and so you
Yes.
trust the people you're with that when they tell you you need to pull the trigger now, there can be a lot worse consequences if they hesitate because you've got some congressperson up there telling them that they could end up in Leavenworth or whatever, and that you should doubt your commanders and those who are giving you orders.
The seditious six, now seditious seven, led by Senator Navy Captain retired Kelly. That bunch, was out there trying to stir something up, and it still, to me, is a mystery of why they did it. But it's to instill doubt, I guess, about the administration being able to conduct their operations. But that's done a whole lot of damage, and it's not something that should happen. We had a podcast we actually did with one of our JAG officers on that, which our listeners can look up on the STARRS website. That was kind of fun, but it's not fun watching people consider that the troops have to stop what they're doing and ask if what they're doing is legal.
Right.
And we know it's legal already. It's already come down through a chain that's already considered it. There have been lawyers that have looked at it already. If it's a frag order to go out and fly someplace and bomb people, or whether it's a deployment order to do something, those things have already gone through a whole litany of looks and feels about whether it's real or not. So the average young soldier, sailor, airman, marine, coast guardsman has no concern really about looking at things to decide whether that thing their commander is telling them is going to be lawful or unlawful. They actually put
Right.
themselves in a very dangerous position of being now subject to a court martial for refusing to obey a lawful order.
Well, that's exactly right. And because we've moved so far away from the warfighting ethos, there's not the reminder that killing is unnatural. I mean, there was a great book on killing by Colonel Grossman who really, laid it out that we do training so that we don't hesitate, but that to kill is, again, particularly coming from a civilized society, is something that does take a mindset leap, that it's not wrong and that you've got to do it and you can't hesitate. And if you don't do it, you or your buddies will die. And that's something they're forgetting. That's also why we don't continue to harp on the illegal order thing to the point that you're going to question orders, legitimate orders that come down. That if you decide to make that decision, most of the stuff, we can look at the My Lai incident, Lieutenant Calley, pretty obvious.
Yep.
You're lining up civilians and mowing them down. Gotcha. We all understand that. There's no question. And there's no reason to
Yep.
remind folks. But there are other situations that, again, I just mentioned one where, you're particularly Iraq and Afghanistan, because you were dealing with an enemy that was hiding among civilians, didn't wear a uniform. You have certain criteria that had to be met to fire back on, but you can always defend yourself. You've got to be ready to pull that trigger. And again, you can't hesitate or folks are going to die.
Yeah, and that's a central part of the professionalism that goes with what we do in the military and we train to all the time. Well, so we got a pretty good I think we've got a pretty good thing going though. Bill, do you not think with today's military?
Oh
I'm
yeah,
actually very happy with the way things have changed in the last year or so. We're getting back on track, and the young folks doing this now every day. God bless them, boy, they're doing a great job.
oh yeah. Now I will say this though, because I agree with you completely. But in talking, for example, with my son and his friends, this is like moving an aircraft carrier, which takes a long time to turn, unlike a
Yes, it
speedboat.
does.
And so, he was talking to me about some of the things he saw, shortly after Trump would have taken office, and this kind of thing of some of the things he saw, coming in, or that were there. And I'm like, look, understand, this stuff has to get flushed out. It's going to take a while. It's not going to be immediate. And so just hang with it. Again, understand that, once you start a pipeline flow, that pipeline's got to get in and move up. And I think it's also why you're still seeing the Secretary of War having to relieve people. There's reasons for why these folks are getting relieved, but it's turning the aircraft carrier. It's not immediate. It takes a bit of time. And so, when you see things that were tolerated before, some of the things that were pushed before, we're going the right direction, but you're going to see some of the leftover with that, and just understand it. So we have a great military. We're going in a great direction. We still got work to do, as I guess the bottom line. It will take some time to turn that aircraft carrier completely to the direction it needs to go.
And there's always a little bit of rough water left behind you anyway. And I think we're dealing with that with the disappearance supposedly of DEI right now. Hasn't entirely gone away, and we'll have to deal with that for a while. But I want to thank you particularly for wanting to help us with our advisory board so that we can continue that kind of work. And there's more to be done. We're working really hard right now on the American Creed and trying to substitute for all of the fake news and the Marxism and ideology that's being preached with something that's real and factual, is based on our own history and our own understanding and values about what America is about. We're busy doing that, and I know that your folks on the advisory board are going to be involved in some of that as we go forward with this. But I wanted to thank you for taking that task on.
Thank you. No, I've watched STARRS for years and appreciate what they did, particularly during the Biden years, and now continuing it on, because it's the same fight that I've been doing individually. It's always good to notice that, like, you're doing things, you're right. I was writing articles, I was doing this stuff, and you realize there's a whole group out there in Colorado, and now beyond Colorado, around the nation, that's fighting the good fight, and just motivating all of us.
Well, it's just like the oath that we took to defend the Constitution. It doesn't go away. And neither does the memory and the things we've done in our military service, I think, for most of us. And so that's why we're kind of continuing this on. And hopefully, the benefactors of that are going to be our children and our grandchildren. And hopefully, they'll find a better way to live in the future, too.
Amen.
So, with that, Bill, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about it. I really enjoyed talking to another military brat about growing up and being in the military. There's so much that we see that I know a lot of other people don't. But hopefully, they'll see some of that if they're watching the podcast we've got today and some of the other ones we're going to do in the future here. So, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Al.
And
Appreciate
thanks
it.
for our audience for joining us. We hope that you've enjoyed this today, and we'll be back with you soon with another episode of Stars and Stripes and the great American dream that we all want to see come to pass. And with that, adios, goodbye. We'll see you another day.